70,000 Roman soldiers stood on the plain outside Edessa in the spring of the year 260, and every one of them believed the same thing. They believed they could not lose. Not like this. Rome had been beaten before. Rome had lost legions in forests and deserts and mountain passes. But in more than 1,000 years, from the founding of the city to that Mesopotamian morning, no ruler of the Roman state had ever been taken alive by a foreign enemy. Not once. The man commanding that army was Publius Licinius Valerianus, the Emperor Valerian, a senator in his 60s who had climbed to the most powerful office on earth, and within days he would be kneeling in the dust as the personal prisoner of the Persian King of Kings. His army would not be destroyed in some heroic last stand. It would be swallowed, almost whole, in one of the strangest and most complete military collapses in ancient history. And here is the detail that should stop you. The Persians did not outfight the legions so much as they outdesigned them. The very formation Rome trusted most, the shield wall discipline that had conquered the Mediterranean world, was turned into the mechanism of its own capture. So how does the most powerful man alive walk 70,000 soldiers into a trap that closes without a decisive battle and end up, if the later stories are true, being used as a footstool by the man who caught him? The answer is not one mistake. It is a chain of 5, and the first one was made years before Valerian ever crossed the Euphrates. Here is exactly what this episode will deconstruct. First, the enemy weapon system Rome had no real answer to, the fully armored cataphract paired with the horse archer, and why that combination made the legion's most famous defensive formation, the testudo, a death sentence on open ground. Second, the invisible force that had already hollowed out Valerian's army before a single arrow flew, a plague so severe that a 2023 interdisciplinary study places it among the defining catastrophes of the entire 3rd century Roman world. Third, the 2 earlier Persian campaigns that told Valerian precisely what was coming, warnings written in the ashes of Antioch, which he read and then marched east anyway. Fourth, the 5 specific decisions in sequence that transformed a relief march into a mass surrender, including the final desperate gamble at the negotiating table that ended with an emperor in chains. And fifth, the stone. Because Shapur I did not just win this campaign, he carved his own account of it into a cliff face at Naqsh-e Rustam, an inscription that survives to this day, and what that stone claims, and what the Romans claimed instead, tells you almost as much about ancient warfare as the battle itself. There is also one grim story about what happened to Valerian after his capture, a story involving dye and a temple wall, and whether you should believe it is a question we will settle near the end. This channel takes apart battles the way an engineer takes apart a failed bridge, decision by decision, load by load, using the surviving sources, the campaign records, and the terrain itself. Edessa is one of the purest case studies we have ever covered, because almost nothing about it went the way either side's textbooks said it should. Start with the man, because the trap only makes sense once you understand what Valerian thought he was walking into. Valerian was not a rash young usurper. According to his entry in the Oxford Classical Dictionary, he was a distinguished senator of the old style, a man with a long administrative career, who had held the consulship and served under multiple emperors, and who was proclaimed emperor in the year 253 by the legions of Rhaetia, in the middle of the period historians bluntly call the crisis of the 3rd century. To grasp what that label means, consider the raw numbers. In the 50 years between 235 and 284, the empire cycled through more than 20 men who could plausibly claim the title of emperor, and nearly all of them died violently, most at the hands of their own soldiers. The average reign in that half-century was measured not in decades but in a couple of years. Recent scholarship on that crisis paints the backdrop in stark terms. The empire Valerian inherited was fighting on every frontier at once. Gothic raiders were crossing the Danube and would soon be launching seaborne raids into the Aegean itself. Frankish and Alemannic warbands were probing the Rhine, and within a decade of Edessa, they would penetrate as far as Italy and Spain. Usurpers were rising in the provinces faster than they could be put down. The silver coinage was collapsing, the Antoninianus debased from roughly 40% silver to a silver wash over bronze within a generation, which meant the state was quietly finding it harder and harder to pay the very armies it depended on. Valerian's answer was to split the burden. He gave the west to his son Gallienus and took the east for himself, the first formal division of imperial responsibility along that axis, a preview of the divided empire that would become permanent a century later. He took the East because the East held the deadliest threat of all, not a tribe, not a raiding confederation, a rival empire. The Sasanian Persians had overthrown the Parthians a generation earlier when Ardashir I crushed the last Parthian king at the Battle of Hormozgan in 224, and Ardashir's son Shapur I styled himself King of Kings of Iran and non-Iran, a title that was less a boast than a mission statement. Where the Parthians had been a loose feudal confederation content to hold their ground, the Sasanians were centralizing, ideological, and expansionist, presenting themselves as heirs of the ancient Achaemenid Persians whose empire had once run to the Aegean. Shapur wanted the Roman East. He had already taken pieces of it twice. And this is the part that makes Edessa so damning. Valerian knew Shapur's methods because Shapur had demonstrated them in 2 full campaigns before the year 260, campaigns documented in detail in studies of the Roman eastern frontier and the Persian wars. In the first, in the year 244, Shapur had fought a Roman emperor, the young Gordian III, on the Euphrates near a place the Persians called Mishish. That campaign ended with Gordian dead, whether in battle as Shapur's inscription claims or murdered by his own officers as the Roman tradition insists, and with his successor Philip the Arab paying, by the Persian account, 500,000 gold denarii to extract the Roman army and buy peace. Shapur was so pleased with the result that he renamed the battlefield Peroz Shapur, victorious is Shapur. In the second campaign, in the early 250s, Shapur did something worse. He annihilated a Roman field army at Barbalissos in Syria, a force his inscription numbers at 60,000 men, and then, with the frontier stripped bare, his columns poured west and sacked Antioch itself, one of the 3 greatest cities of the Roman world, a city of perhaps 500,000 people. His inscription lists some 37 cities and fortresses captured or burned in that one campaign, a catalogue of destruction running through Syria and Cappadocia. One later Roman story claims the people of Antioch were watching a performance in the theater when an actor looked up and told the audience. The Persians were already inside the walls. Think about what that means. Within living memory, within Valerian's own adult career, Persia had killed 1 Roman army in the field, extorted a ransom for a second, and burned the capital of Roman Syria. The pattern was established. Shapur did not fight the way steppe raiders fought, hit and withdraw. He fought campaigns of deep penetration, designed to shatter field armies and strip cities, and, crucially, to carry their populations home. Valerian marched east in the late 250s to reverse those losses, retook Antioch, stabilized the frontier, and for a moment it seemed to work. Then, around the year 260, Shapur came back a 3rd time and put the fortress city of Edessa under siege. Edessa sat in northern Mesopotamia, on the site of modern Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, guarding the roads that led into Anatolia. If it fell, the door to Asia Minor swung open. Valerian gathered the Eastern Field Army, a force Shapur's own inscription would later number at 70,000 men drawn. The stone says, from virtually every province of the empire, Germany, Britain, the Danube lands, Africa, the East, and marched to relieve the city. He was an old man leading a sick army toward an enemy who had beaten Rome twice in 15 years. And he was confident. That confidence is the first thing we have to explain. To understand it, you have to understand what a Roman heavy infantry army was designed to do, and then you have to understand the machine Shapur had built to break it. Studies of Roman fighting tactics describe an instrument refined over centuries. The legionary was an armored close-quarters specialist. He carried a large shield, the scutum, a short thrusting sword, and heavy javelins, the pila, weapons with an effective throwing range of perhaps 20 to 30 meters, and he fought shoulder to shoulder in disciplined lines that could grind through almost any enemy willing to stand and trade blows. Against threats that would not close, against arrows. The legion had an answer so famous, it became a symbol of Rome itself, the testudo, the tortoise. Shields locked to the front, shields raised overhead, an entire unit sealed inside a moving shell of wood and iron. Descriptions of Roman infantry tactics are clear about what the testudo was for. It was a close defensive formation, superb for resisting arrow fire, superb for approaching fortress walls under a hail of missiles. So sturdy that ancient writers claimed a chariot could be driven across the top of one. Inside the shell, men were nearly safe, and that is exactly why it became the killing mechanism at Edessa. Because the testudo has a cost, and the cost is everything else. A unit in testudo can barely see, it can barely maneuver, it moves at a crawl, it cannot throw its javelins effectively, it cannot charge, it is a fortress, and a fortress does not attack. Now look at what Shapur brought to the plain. The Sasanian army was built around two complementary arms. The first was the horse archer, fast, mobile, armed with a powerful composite bow, a laminated weapon of wood, horn, and sinew whose recurved design stored far more energy than its size suggests, giving it an effective range of 150 meters or more, 5 times the reach of the legionary's javelin. A trained horse archer could loose several aimed arrows a minute while circling at a canter, and he could shoot backward over his horse's tail while withdrawing, the famous Parthian shot that the Sasanians inherited along with the empire. The second arm was the cataphract, and if you have never seen a reconstruction of one, it is worth pausing on. Man and horse both armored, head to hoof, in scale and mail, a rider carrying the contos, a two-handed lance 3.5 to 4 meters long, couched or gripped in both fists, the whole package functioning less like cavalry as Rome knew it and more like a battering ram with a heartbeat. The Romans who fought the most heavily armored variant called them clibanarii, a word derived from a bread oven, because that is what it felt like to be sealed inside that much metal under a Mesopotamian sun, and the joke tells you something important. These were men willing to endure furnace conditions for the payoff of near invulnerability at the moment of impact. Rome had seen this system before, and had been ruined by it before. In 53 BC, at Carrhae, barely 40 kilometers from Edessa across the same northern Mesopotamian plain, the Parthian general Shapur had used 10,000 horsemen, archers resupplied by a camel train carrying thousands of spare arrows, to destroy the 7 legions of Marcus Licinius Crassus, killing or capturing perhaps 30,000 Romans and taking the general's head. 3 centuries later, Rome was marching an army into nearly the same ground against a refined version of the same machine. Accounts of cataphract warfare describe the sequence with almost mechanical clarity. The horse archers encircled a Roman formation and bombarded it with arrows. The legionaries, bleeding and unable to reply, do the trained thing, the disciplined thing, the Roman thing. They lock shields, they form the testudo, and the moment they do, they have stopped moving. They are now a stationary target on open ground. That is when the cataphracts come in, a mass of armored horsemen hitting a formation that cannot brace properly, cannot countercharge, and cannot run, lances striking with the combined momentum of horse, rider, and armor at the gallop. Break the shell, and the horse archers finish what spills out. Each arm forces the exact response that the other arm punishes. It is one of the most elegant tactical bindings in ancient warfare, and the terrain around Edessa, open Mesopotamian plain, flat, dry, made for cavalry, was the ideal board on which to play it. Rome's own cavalry doctrine, as studies of Roman cavalry tactics make plain, was built primarily for scouting, screening, and pursuit, not for defeating this kind of integrated missile and shock system head-on. The Roman military did eventually learn the lesson, raising its own cataphract units and building the cavalry-centered armies of the 4th century, but that adaptation came 2 generations too late for the men on the plain in 260. Valerian was bringing an infantry hammer to a problem shaped like water. But the weapon system alone did not doom him, because Roman armies had survived horse-archer warfare before. Mark Antony had extracted most of an army from Parthia. Trajan and Septimius Severus had marched to the Persian Gulf and back. What made 260 different was that Valerian's army was already dying before it arrived. Through the 250s, a pestilence historians call the Plague of Cyprian was burning through the Roman world, named for Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, whose treatise De Mortalitate, written around the year 252, preserves an eyewitness clinical description. The bowels loosened into constant flux. Cyprian wrote, fire in the throat, eyes bloodshot and burning, vomiting, and in some victims the putrefaction and loss of hands and feet, and hearing and sight destroyed in survivors. Modern scholars, most prominently the historian Kyle Harper, have argued from those symptoms that the pathogen may have been a viral hemorrhagic fever, something in the family of Ebola-like diseases, though smallpox and pandemic influenza remain candidates, and a 2023 interdisciplinary study situating that plague within the broader outlines of Roman history treats it not as a footnote but as a structural force of the era, part of the same cluster of catastrophes that defines the 3rd century crisis. The later Roman sources claim that at its peak the disease killed 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone, a figure we cannot verify but which tells us how the epidemic was remembered, and it moved fastest exactly where people were packed together, in cities and in army camps, where hundreds of men shared tents, cookpots, and latrines. The Roman sources on the Edessa campaign say plainly that pestilence struck Valerian's force as it operated in the east. Consider what that does to an army beyond the raw deaths. Every sick man still has to be fed and carried, so the disease consumes supplies without contributing spears. Ranks thin unevenly, so units lose cohesion, and the centurions and veteran file closers who die take irreplaceable institutional knowledge with them, replaced by whoever can be found. Morale curdles because a soldier can steel himself against an enemy he can see, but not against a fever that takes the man sleeping next to him. There is even evidence the plague constricted recruitment and tax revenue across whole provinces, which meant the sick army could not easily be reinforced or even reliably paid. Historians studying the 3rd century crisis have argued that epidemic disease was one of the quiet engines behind the whole period's military disasters, a factor that operated underneath the battles, and there is an earlier precedent for the argument. A 2007 study of the Antonine Plague and the crisis of the Roman Empire traced how an epidemic a century before, the one that struck under Marcus Aurelius, had degraded Roman military capacity in ways the sources only reluctantly admit, forcing emergency recruitment of gladiators and slaves to fill the legions. At Edessa, the pattern repeated at the worst possible moment. Shapur's scouts did not need to count Roman standards, they needed only to count Roman graves. So place the 3 dimensions side by side, because each one reveals a different face of the same disaster. The first dimension is the weapon mismatch, an infantry army whose signature defensive reflex converted it into a stationary target for armored shock cavalry on the flattest, driest, most cavalry-friendly ground in the Roman world. The second is the biological one, an army losing men to disease daily, which meant time itself fought for Shapur. Every week of delay made the Roman force weaker and the Persian position stronger, which is the precise inversion of how sieges are supposed to work for a relief army. Normally, the besieger is the one racing the clock, watching his supplies dwindle and disease breed in his static camp while the relief force gathers strength. At Edessa, the arithmetic ran backward, and the third dimension is the strategic one, the pattern from the earlier campaigns. Shapur had shown at Barbarissos that his preferred victory was not a wall of enemy dead, but the destruction of the enemy's capacity to field an army at all, and his inscription's obsessive accounting of captured men and deported populations shows why. The Sasanian Empire wanted labor, engineers, craftsmen, taxpayers. After the sack of Antioch, Shapur had marched thousands of its citizens east and settled them in a new city in Khuzestan whose Persian name translates, with magnificent arrogance, as better than Antioch. Shapur built this. A study of Shapur as the captor of Valerian in the history of Persia underlines the point. For the King of Kings, a captured Roman army was worth incomparably more than a slaughtered one. It was a portable workforce with skills, engineering, surveying, masonry that the Iranian plateau could not produce in such concentration. Rome fought battles to win fields. Shapur fought campaigns to harvest people. Once you see that, the endgame at Edessa stops looking like an accident and starts looking like the whole design. Now walk the chain itself. The 5 decisions that closed the trap, in the order they were made. Decision 1. Valerian concentrated the entire Eastern Field Army into a single force and led it in person, with his praetorian prefect and a train of senior officials, senators, and the treasury needed to pay 70,000 men, all inside the same column. The logic was imperial prestige. After Antioch's sack, the East needed to see the emperor himself restore Roman honor, and there was a harder political calculation underneath. In an age when any successful general could be proclaimed emperor by his troops, Valerian could not safely hand this army to a subordinate. The cost was that Rome placed its army, its eastern command structure, and the legitimacy of the throne itself inside one perimeter. There was no reserve, no second force to threaten Shapur's flanks or cover a retreat. One army, one emperor, one point of failure. Decision 2. He marched that army directly toward the besieged city, across open Mesopotamian ground, into terrain that maximized every Persian advantage and neutralized every Roman one. A slower approach along fortified lines, a war of posts that forced Shapur to bleed against walls, would have played to Roman strengths in engineering and siegecraft, the same strengths that made Roman fortress cities like Edessa itself so hard for the Persians to crack quickly. There was even a strategic alternative on the map, a counter-thrust down the Euphrates at Persian territory to force Shapur to abandon the siege and defend his own lines of communication. Instead, the relief army offered Shapur exactly the battle space his cavalry system was built for, flat, open, and far from friendly walls, and it did so while the campaigning season's heat was rising and the plague was still in the ranks. Decision 3. When the Persian horsemen appeared, not as a battle line but as an encircling swarm, the army responded with its training rather than with an answer to the actual problem. The sources describing this style of engagement lay out the sequence we covered earlier: arrows forcing the shell forcing immobility, immobility inviting the lance. This is what had killed Crassus's army at Carrhae 3 centuries before, and the countermeasures that had worked for other Roman commanders, massed slingers and archers of their own, aggressive light cavalry screens, relentless forward movement, were exactly the assets a plague-thinned infantry army lacked. A Roman army that kept moving, that accepted casualties to preserve momentum toward the city or back toward its supply line, retained options. An army that halted and turtled on the plain retained none. The discipline that had built the empire executed flawlessly, and executing flawlessly was precisely the trap. Decision 4. Surrounded, with the pestilence still working through the ranks and supplies failing, Valerian chose to hold his position rather than accept the brutal arithmetic of a fighting breakout. A breakout through cataphracts would have cost him perhaps a third of the army and his own dignity. A Roman emperor running from Persians, and for a 60-year-old ruler whose legitimacy rested on restoring Roman honor in the East, that price may have looked unpayable. Holding cost him everything, because it converted a battle into a blockade, and a blockade was the one form of engagement the sick, starving Roman force could not win. Zosimus, one of our fellow Roman narrators of the campaign, records that the army was pressed by famine and plague together, and that the soldiers themselves began pushing for a resolution, any resolution. Shapur, reading the situation perfectly, declined to spend his cavalry on a costly assault when hunger and fever were doing the work without cost. He had learned patience the profitable way at Mysic in 244, when a trapped Roman army had simply paid him 500,000 gold pieces to go home. Decision 5, the fatal one. Valerian tried to negotiate his way out. The Roman accounts say he sought terms, reportedly offering an enormous payment in gold, the same instrument that had extracted a Roman army from Persia once before, in the days of Gordian III and Philip the Arab. Precedent said it would work. Precedent was wrong because the precedent had been set when Shapur's position was merely strong, and now it was absolute. He went to the parley, and the traditions preserved in the sources differ on exactly what happened next. Zosimus describes Valerian going to meet Shapur with a small retinue and being seized, an ambush at the negotiation itself, a violation of every convention of parley in the ancient world. Peter the Patrician preserves the diplomatic aftermath. Other accounts fold the capture into a final collapse of the encircled army, and one hostile Roman tradition even insinuates that Valerian, despairing of his mutinous, starving troops, half-delivered himself to the enemy. What no source disputes is the outcome. Shapur took the Emperor of Rome alive, with my own hands. As his inscription puts it, along with the Praetorian prefect, senators and officers, and the surrounded army, leaderless and starving, went into captivity with him. 70,000 men by the Persian count marched east not as soldiers but as property, and that is the resolution of the first question we posed. There was no decisive battle at Edessa in the classical sense, no clash of lines with a victor at sundown. There was a machine that closed one ratchet at a time, and the last click was a handshake. Here is the part of this story almost nobody spends time on, and it may be the most historically valuable piece of the entire episode. We have the winner's own words in stone. On the walls of a square tower called the Kabaye Zartosht at Naqsh-e Rustam, near the rock-cut tombs of the old Achaemenid kings, Shapur carved a trilingual inscription, Middle Persian, Parthian, and Greek, that scholars call the Res Gestae Divi Sapuris, the deeds of the divine Shapur, completed before the year 272. The choice of Greek matters. Shapur wanted the Roman world itself to be able to read what had happened to it. Epigraphic editions of that inscription preserve his account in his own voice. In it, Shapur narrates all 3 campaigns against Rome, names the 70,000-man army and lists the provinces it was drawn from, and states flatly that he captured Valerian himself, along with the prefect and the senators, and deported the captives into Persis, Parthia, Khuzestan, and the provinces of his empire, and the stone is not alone. Shapur commissioned rock reliefs at Naqsh-e Rustam and at his new city of Shapur that render the claim an image, the mounted King of Kings gripping the wrist of a standing Roman, the gesture of capture, while another Roman figure kneels in supplication, a composition most scholars read as Valerian seized, and Philip the Arab begging for peace, 2 humiliated emperors compressed into a single frame. This is extraordinarily rare. For most ancient battles, we have only the loser's literature, filtered through centuries of copying. For Edessa, we have a contemporary victory monument from the winning king, in 3 languages and carved stone, and we can set it against the Roman tradition and watch the 2 versions fight. The Romans, for their part, could not erase the event, so they reframed it, and a 2018 study in Brill's Companion to Military Defeat in Ancient Mediterranean Society traces exactly how. Roman writers like Zosimus and Aurelius Victor recast the catastrophe as treachery, an emperor seized at a sacred parley rather than beaten, which conveniently indicts Persian faithlessness instead of Roman generalship. Later Christian authors went further, and they had a motive the pagan writers lacked, because in 257 and 258 Valerian had issued edicts launching one of the fiercest persecutions of Christians in Roman history, the persecution that executed Cyprian of Carthage himself, the same bishop who described the plague. So when Lactantius, writing his treatise on the deaths of the persecutors half a century later, tells us that the aged emperor was forced to kneel as a mounting block whenever Shapur climbed onto his horse, and that after death his skin was flayed, dyed scarlet, and hung in a Persian temple to be shown to visiting Roman envoys, understand that Lactantius is writing theology, a catalogue of divine vengeance on emperors who touched the church. Should you believe the footstool and the dyed skin? Treat them with heavy suspicion. Those details appear in hostile, moralizing accounts written generations later by authors with every reason to make Valerian's fate as lurid as possible, and Shapur's own inscription, which brags freely about everything else, every burned city, every captured province, says nothing of the kind. Persian royal practice, for what it is worth, tended to keep captive kings as living trophies, displayed at court, not destroyed. What the sober evidence does support is bleak enough. Valerian died in captivity, never ransomed, never released, the only Roman emperor in the empire's entire history to whom that happened, and his son Gallienus, tellingly, mounted no rescue expedition and negotiated no ransom, because a captive emperor was a political impossibility better left unmentioned. Persian tradition holds that his captured soldiers and engineers were put to work on Shapur's building projects in Khuzestan, and here the physical evidence is stunning, because at Shushtar in southwestern Iran there still stands a 500-meter combined dam and bridge, a piece of unmistakably Roman engineering, arched, buttressed, built to throttle the river Kairon, known to this day as the Band-e-Caesar, Caesar's Dam. Roman opus cementicium in the service of the King of Kings. The army that marched to relieve Edessa ended its existence pouring concrete for the man who caught it, and its work outlasted both empires. Step back and weigh what this single spring actually cost. Rome lost a field army, an emperor, and something harder to rebuild than either, the millennium-old certainty that whatever else happened, the person of the Roman ruler was beyond an enemy's reach. The eastern provinces were left naked, and what followed proves how completely the regular structure had failed, because the empire survived the next decade not through Roman arms but through improvisation. 2 officers from the wreckage of the Eastern Command, Macrianus and Ballista, rallied survivors and actually checked Persian raiding columns, then promptly used their success to proclaim Macrianus' sons emperors, adding civil war to catastrophe. And the real counterstroke came from a city-state, from Odenathus, the lord of the caravan city of Palmyra, who fell on Shapur's plunder-laden army as it withdrew toward the Euphrates, mauled it, and in the following years drove Persian forces back to the walls of their own capital at Ctesiphon twice. Gallienus, with no better option, legitimized him with grand titles, and within a decade Odeionothus's widow Zenobia had converted that improvised command into a breakaway empire that swallowed Egypt and most of the Roman East. That is the second-order consequence of Edessa. The capture of one emperor did not just lose a battle, it delegated Roman sovereignty to whoever could actually fight, and it took a soldier emperor of genius, Aurelian, to stitch the empire back together in the 270s. Historians of the 3rd century crisis mark the 260s as the moment the empire came nearest to complete disintegration. 3 empires where one had been, and Edessa is the hinge of that decade. Yet the deepest lesson is not about Rome's weakness. It is about how systems fail. Valerian's legions did not break because the men were cowards or the training was poor. They broke because their training was perfect, perfectly matched to the last war, and their enemy had built a system whose every component was designed to reward Roman doctrine for doing exactly what it was drilled to do. The testudo did not fail at Edessa. It succeeded, and its success was the trap. Any institution that has refined one answer for centuries should read that sentence twice. When your most trusted reflex meets an opponent who has planned around it, the reflex itself becomes the vulnerability, and discipline becomes the mechanism of collapse. Rome, to its credit, eventually absorbed the lesson. The cavalry-heavy armies and mobile field forces of the late empire are Edessa's children. But institutions learn from catastrophe at the price of the men inside the catastrophe. Shapur understood the principle in the year 260. The stone at Naqsh-e Rustam has been repeating it for 18 centuries in 3 languages to anyone willing to listen. If this kind of deconstruction is why you watch, a battle taken apart down to its last load-bearing decision, subscribe to the War Room Files and tap the like button so more students of history find the channel. I will see you at the next collapse.